Hello and welcome to Sophie & Co. Me, Sophie Shevardnadze. And today we're talking about Syria again. U.S. military strikes are being held back and may not take place at all, in no small part thanks to Russia. But is it progress in a war that has already cost so many lives, or are we back to square one?
Millions of people displaced. Hundreds of thousands killed. Endless fights with little advantage to either side push the end of the civil war in Syria beyond the horizon, while both Assad and the rebels are running on weapons supplied by their powerful respective allies. Do the Syrians care who wins anymore? Would a possible intervention solve anything or just worsen the disaster? Who has the key to the door which leads to peace?
And our guest today is Hans Blix, who worked as the UN's chief weapons inspector at the time Iraq was accused of having weapons of mass destruction and was invaded as a result. Mr. Blix, it's really great to have you with us on the show. Now, Russia's latest offer to hand over the control of Syria's chemical stockpiles to the international community. Can you call it a diplomatic success, or is it still too early to talk?
I think it is a success so far because it has opened a dialogue about possible peaceful solutions. Only to exclude chemical weapons and punish a use for it is not enough. Over 100,000 Syrians have died in this war, and it continues to rage. And I think what we need is a ceasefire and talks about a conference in which the relevant parties get together and find an interim regime.
You know, here in Russia, there were a lot of jokes circulating in the social media about how Obama should hand over his Nobel Prize to Vladimir Putin. What do you make of that?
I think it's a little premature, maybe. But I think that the two leaders, and also Mr. Lavrov and Mr. Kerry, have a tremendous responsibility. The Security Council is not all that good as a policeman, but we don't want individual countries, whether the US or Russia or China or anybody else, to be the world's policeman. We hope that the permanent members of the Security Council will exercise their responsibility and work together as the UN Charter was intended.
You know, despite backing down on what they call local strikes on Syria, the U.S. rhetoric is still pretty intense. Do you believe intervention's been cancelled, or is just a delay?
No, I think that there are incredibly complicated problems, and I think the focus now is enormously on the technicalities of inspections of chemical weapons. But one should also think about how can we end the hostilities, how can we end the fighting. And it seems to me that the great powers have influence there. The war could hardly continue if the fighting parties did not get more money and get more weapons. And I think that Saudi Arabia perhaps and Qatar are reported to supply the rebels, and Russia and Iran and perhaps the Hezbollah are reported to supply weapons and money to the other side. I think if we could be agreed in the Security Council that all the suppliers should stop giving weapons and should demand a ceasefire and a conference, then we might save blood. To punish is understandable, that one wants to do that we want the end of the chemical weapons, that's good. But what the main thing is, after all, to stop the war.
You know, if I may, I just want to talk a little bit more about this possible strike, because if it does take place, it would change the course of event greatly. So the way things are looking as of now, the Congress would most probably have voted against the strike. Well, that's according to the latest survey. So could Obama have chosen to delay the strike in order to gain more support? I mean, plus Syria has been propelled into the mass media, especially the Western version of the events. And, you know, the more you talk about it, the more it looks like the intervention is the only solution.
Well, the strike is not a solution. It is a penalty and has much to do with the American wish to uphold the credibility of the US president. Mr. Obama once warned Assad that if he were to use chemical weapons, that would change Mr. Obama's calculation. That was taken as a promise that he would intervene, and now he's held to that promise. But there is another promise behind this that is also perhaps even more important. That is the statement from the US side and others that they will not allow Iran to get closer to a nuclear weapon. And many people feel that if they now give way to Syria and do not carry out a strike, this would show the US as paper tiger vis-à-vis Iran. So there are many additional complications to this, and I think both Russia and Iran play an important role in this. And I'm glad that the initiative was taken by Mr. Putin, and I think they must live up to the fact that we and the rest of the world, we expect the permanent members of the Security Council to try to solve the problems and avoid bloodshed.
Mm-hmm. From what I understand, you support the original U.S. version of events, that it was Assad who carried out the attack on August 21st. But it would seem to me that it's a suicidal and utterly stupid move on behalf of Assad, who was actually starting to defeat the rebels at the time of the attack. What makes you believe it was him? Have you seen any solid proof?
Well, I agree with that reasoning. I think it was a disastrous decision on the part of Assad, and that's why I think in Moscow they thought it couldn't have been him. But the evidence that is gradually coming forward, I think nevertheless points to him. I don't think we should pass judgment on it until we have the reports of the international inspector, the UN inspectors. They are not asked to say who committed it, but even so, we have appointed, we have sent the inspectors, and we should listen to them, and maybe one can draw some conclusions also about responsibility. I'm inclining to think that so much has come also from independent sources to believe that yes, the regime was behind this attack. It doesn't exclude that rebels might have used chemical weapons, improvised chemical weapons in earlier stage. I don't exclude that. That should also be investigated. And that was actually why the inspectors were sent there, to investigate all earlier uses of chemical weapons.
So just to make sure you don't exclude that it may have been the rebels, because Russia says the attack could have been provocation on the part of the rebels.
Yeah, I don't believe that. I think the scale points to a large organization that was behind it. But that doesn't mean that I approve of the idea of a punitive strike. I think we must not bypass the Security Council. Mm-hmm. In Washington, they do not hold so much for the United Nations, but for the rest of the world, we would like to see the Council function. That requires also statesman-like behavior, both by Russia and by the US.
You know, like you said, the strike itself, would it have solved anything?
I think that's a very valid objection. I mean, it's a punishment, but it doesn't really solve anything. And it's somewhat pathetic, I think, to kill and to strike and then say, now you can go on with your war, but use other means.
Yeah.
This is not humane thinking.
Now, you were chief of the UN weapons inspection team when the West went to war with Iraq. How was it determined that Saddam had the weapons of mass destruction?
Well, that was determined back in 1991 when Saddam occupied Kuwait, and we went in. I was the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency at that time, and we could then, our inspectors were sent in, and we could see how they were building calatrons and how they were preparing a nuclear weapon. But all that was taken out during the 90s. Very harsh sanctions that the Iraqi people suffered under. But they did not reconstruct the program of weapons of mass destruction. That was suspected and alleged and claimed by the US and by the UK. And we were sent in to verify it in the 2002. We spent 700 inspections there all over the country, and we could only report that we did not find any weapons. And indeed, there weren't any. So the second war, the war in 2003, was an unnecessary and a horrible war. It was meant to establish democracy, and what it achieved then was anarchy.
So you, out of all people, you would know, in case of Syria, how does the UN carry out its analysis?
Well, it's the Secretary General that has taken the initiative to send inspectors and to negotiate with Assad for some inspection. But for the rest, it is these members of the Security Council who have the responsibility. And the Secretariat assists by analysis and by collecting data and so forth. But the responsibility rests with the 5 permanent members, but also the other 10 members of the Security Council. They have to sit down and work day and night to find a way that also saves the face as many as one can.
But would Obama listen to objections from the United Nations if he got the approval of Congress, which in itself is doubtful? Or would he just push on with his plans, because we've seen it happen before? What's the role of the United Nations if nobody really listens to it?
Well, they do. I mean, the case of Iraq in 1991, Russia and China rallied to the others and agreed on a UN intervention to stop the occupation, and it was President Bush Sr. who did very much of that. It was a successful, great moment. In the case of Libya, there was also an agreement. Russia feels that the Western states sort of extended or used it too extensively, and they felt perhaps a little trapped in it. But nevertheless, it was an agreement in the Security Council. It's difficult to reach such agreements, but they need to do it more often. We, the world, expect them in the Council to act responsibly for the whole world, not only in their own narrow interests.
You know, the latest UN report suggests both Assad and the rebels are guilty of war crimes. The rebels have allegedly carried out even more killings than Assad. How can the West side with them? I mean, clearly, if Obama is to strike, it can't possibly be neutral.
I think it is fairly clear that there are awful war crimes committed on both sides in this war. And some people talk about the use of the International Criminal Court, and I think it's a step forward that we have such a court that can examine cases and decide who was guilty, but it should be in all directions. And if the court is engaged in this situation, and that's a possibility, I think they should examine all the war crimes that are committed to be taken up when possible, when hostilities are over.
All right, after the break, what place do superpowers hold in the crisis and war without end? Is that what's in store for Syria? Stay tuned. Welcome back. We're talking about Syria and the political games surrounding it with former UN Chief Weapons Inspector Hans Blix. Great to have you back. Now, logically, if Assad is removed, who will take his place? I mean, are the possible candidates already proving to be just as bad, if not worse?
I don't know. I think what the aim should be is a conference in which the interested parties, various groups are there. There will be the Alawites, and I think probably Assad will have to step aside, but he is not the only one in that movement. There will be the rebel movements, and there will be the US, and there will be Russia, and I'm sure Iran must be there, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. All those who are involved in it will have to be there. And the aim must be to get, and it's incredibly difficult after this bloody war, aim must be to create an interim authority that represents all the various groups in Syria.
I can't possibly imagine how could anyone who comes
eventually.
Yeah, it's just hard to imagine anyone coming to power and reconciling with the people after everything that has happened, no matter which side takes the lead. But
No.
If you look at the things globally, whose war is it at this point? Of the Syrians on the ground, or is it more of a Russian-US political standoff?
Well, on your first question, I mean, there have been situations with terrible atrocities happening, and yet the parties can come together. We know South Africa was one situation in which a horrible apartheid had been there, and yet you found a reconciliation. Nigeria has happened, but it is incredibly difficult. I agree with you. But it's the only way. If the alternative is continued civil war, well, that is pretty horrible. What was your second question?
My second question is, at this point, do you think it's a war of Syrians on the ground, or is it more of a Russia-US political standoff?
Well, one might say that basically the war is a contest between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Saudi Arabia wants to have a Sunni Muslim government in Syria, and Iran wants to have a government that is siding more with the Shiite side. This goes on in many parts of the Middle East, and I think we on the Western side, we think that they ought to coexist, the two. And there is, of course, there was a hope on the US side that if the Sunnis came into power, they would get a regime that would not be friendly with Iran. And there was a fear on the Iranian and Russian side that if they got such a regime, it would be to their disadvantage. However, I think that the question of the Iranian nuclear efforts to expand its nuclear program is an issue that should be settled and solved apart from the Syrian conflict. And with a new government in Tehran, I think there is hope for somewhat more conciliant measures, some interim steps that might lead to less tension. That is very important because it has to do with avoiding spread of weapons of mass destruction. There was an opportunity missed, I think, last year when the US blocked the holding of a conference in Helsinki on a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. That was regrettable. I think we need to get back to that. We need a Middle East that is free not only of chemical weapons but also of nuclear weapons.
But do you side with the speculations in the West that Syria, for the West, is actually just a way to get to Iran?
Well, I think the U.S. support for the rebellion in the beginning was certainly a support by people, democratic people, who wanted to see a less brutal, less oppressive regime in Syria. At the same time, I think that the government hoped that if you were to topple Assad, that might bring into government a regime that would not be friendly to Iran. But as the war went on, the world saw that there were many different forces on the rebel side, and that perhaps you would get a regime that was very fundamentalist Islamic and perhaps more dangerous to Israel as well. And therefore, the outside has not been so keen to really make a difference in the war and to side. The U.S. have been very reluctant to send in any weapons, which the rebels have wanted. So I think the outside world would like to have a regime that is inclusive at this stage, but they should also press more for actually stopping the hostilities, because we have over 100,000 dead.
But as much as West and America may dislike the current Iranian regime, I mean, it is pretty clear that if the West wants to find a solution to Syrian crisis, that is, one more time I emphasize, if they want to find a solution, that Iran could actually play a key role in regulating. Do they realize that?
Yes, I think so. Yes, I think they do. But the feelings in the U.S. vis-à-vis Iran have been very, very strong in the past, and they still are. On the other hand, I think they have to notice that there is a new government in Tehran, a government that has been very much more open to discussions and wish to end the war, but end the conflict. At the same time, it must not be a solution that is humiliating for Iran. It's a proud people, and they are proud of their achievements, and that has to be taken into account. But I think there is hope for some progress on the issue of the Iranian nuclear program, and it should be even more ambitious. It should be an ambition to have a zone free both of weapons of mass destruction or nuclear weapons, and also of the means of producing them. That would mean that Israel would have to do away with its nuclear weapons and its reprocessing. Iran would have to do away with its enrichment program, and others in the region would have to commit themselves not to enrich uranium, and also assurance of supply of the fuel that they need for the nuclear power reactors in the region.
Mm-hmm. If we get back to Russia, this country supplies weapons to Syria, and it's legal. Now, the West supports the rebels, including military aid, and I'm not sure how legal that is. Why is the UN not putting an arms supply embargo on both sides?
I think that's what they should agree to, and I think that they should exert pressure on those who they supply weapons to accept a ceasefire within a certain date. This is not an easy thing. Mr. Lavrov and Mr. Kerry are going to meet in Geneva now, and that is fine. They have 2 days. Maybe that will not be enough. But the great thing about the initiative from Russia now is that there is an opening for talks rather than simply a positioning, political positioning, and mutual accusations.
Look, when the chemical stockpiles are transferred under international control, the war may go on for God knows how long still. So will the U.S. be fine with that as long as no chemical weapons are used?
Well, I think it would be practically very difficult to have international inspectors supervising the elimination of the chemical weapons. It may be not so difficult for the regime, for Assad regime, to issue a commitment not to use them, and a commitment to declare what they have, and a commitment to destroy them. But actually to carry this out fully during a civil war that is raging, I think is practically very difficult. Mm-hmm. Moreover, perhaps one should not get lost in these technicalities. What are the risks that Assad would use chemical weapons once more if he did it on this time. I think he would have narrowly escaped from a punitive strike by the US. Would he then risk another occasion of this, which certainly would bring about an international military action? I don't
well, that
think
is
so.
if he carried out a strike in the first place, and that is, we have to find out. Now, the chemical stockpile handover to Russia or any other third party, how is it physically possible? Peacekeepers on the ground, taking them out of the country. Can you walk us through that?
I think it is exceedingly difficult. We know that under the Chemical Weapons Convention, the US and Russia have agreed to the convention. It has taken them many, many years to do away with their chemical weapons. And to do that, to begin to do that during a civil war, I think is even harder. So I don't think it sounds very practical. But the beginning of it is an opening. It's an opening for talks leading to a ceasefire. And that is very important. The first steps are easy. The next steps are very, very difficult, if not impossible.
You know, I was reading a Pentagon research paper yesterday, and it states that 75,000 troops would be needed to take care of Syria's chemical stockpiles. And that's a number that's not even definite yet. So this could equal up to like a mini occupation of the country, no?
Yes. I think the figures were given to demonstrate how incredibly difficult it would be to do away with chemical weapons during a war. So it's not practicable. Let us see what is good about it. The good about the proposal is that we do not have a strike yet. We could have had a strike a week ago. We haven't had this military action yet, but there is talk about the elimination of the weapon. We must also remember that there are other countries in the region that may have chemical weapons still, that have not ratified the Chemical Weapons Convention. And there are reports that Israel had chemical weapons in the past. Whether they still have it, I don't know. But there are reports that they had it in the past.
Well, now, just to resume it, now this policy of non-intervention is a better one. That's your quote. But with this much involvement of both the West and Russia already, and like you said, the Saudi Arabia, can we call it a local war? I mean, it feels like it's like a third world war coming to, you know, to completion.
Well, it's like many earlier wars. It's a local, but with interventions from any side. We talk about the U.S. intervention, but of course the selling of or sending of weapons from neighboring states to the rebels, and sending of weapons to Assad from Iran and perhaps Russia and others. These are also interventions. This keeps the war going. I mean, without support of weapons and money from the outside, they could not fight. So the war is fed by the outside world. And the outside world, in my view, should stop feeding the war.
Well, with the West clearly on the rebel side, what are Assad's chances, actually, to getting his country out of the mess? Is there a chance?
Well, Assad seemed to have the upper hand a while ago, but that may be a temporary thing. The only sure thing is that the war goes on very much. And that is what we have a responsibility to try to stop.
Well, that's it for today. Our guest was Hans Blix, ex-UN Chief Weapons Inspector. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next edition of Sophie & Co.